The fog rolled into Briarwood like a slow tide, swallowing the village in its damp, silvery embrace. It crept along the cobblestone streets, pressed against the crooked cottages, and muffled the sounds of life within. Tonight, Margaret Whittaker stood on her front porch, clutching her shawl tight around her shoulders, peering into the shifting mist. Her heart pounded in her chest when she heard it. Her brother's voice, soft and pleading, but Henry had been dead for 2 years. Margaret's breath hitched, and a cold sweat broke across her brow. The voice grew closer, whispering her name with the same warmth and familiarity. She remembered. She slammed the door shut, bolting it twice, but the voice lingered outside, scratching against the edges of her mind. She wasn't alone. All across the village, others whispered of the voices they heard each night, voices of their lost loved ones, calling from the mist. Briarwood had once been a quiet, isolated village nestled deep within the valley, surrounded by dense woods and rolling hills. The villagers led simple lives, tending to gardens, trading at the market and gathering at Rosewood Inn to share warm drinks and quiet conversation. Life was predictable, comforting in its routines. But the arrival of the fog changed everything. People hurried home before sunset, bolting their doors and lighting candles that flickered behind lace-curtained windows. The once vibrant marketplace turned into a hushed, wary affair. Even the church bell, which once signaled joyous occasions, now rang each evening as a warning. Marking the fog's return, whispers spread through the streets like wildfire, each story more chilling than the last. Some believed the mist carried the spirits of the dead, longing to be heard. Others suspected something more sinister lurking within, something that mimicked their loved ones too perfectly. Margaret had never considered herself a brave woman, but the fog had made courage a necessity. A widow with no children, she spent most of her days tending to her small herb garden and reading by the fire. She had always been practical, relying on reason and logic, but the voices in the mist were beginning to gnaw at her certainty. Her brother Henry had drowned in the river 2 years ago, and she had grieved him deeply. Now, hearing his voice call to her from beyond the grave, she found herself gripped by a terrible curiosity. Was it possible that his spirit lingered, or was it something else entirely? Something wearing his voice like a mask? Margaret knew she couldn't ignore the growing unease in Briarwood. She resolved to investigate, to uncover the truth behind the mist before it consumed them all. The fog had always felt unnatural, but now it seemed almost sentient. Dogs refused to leave their homes after dusk, and the birds no longer sang in the mornings. Even the trees that lined the village square seemed to lean inward, as if burdened by the weight of something unseen. Mrs. Glover, the town baker, discovered deep claw marks in her garden, too large for any known animal. Tom Jenkins, the blacksmith, swore he saw a figure moving in the fog, tall and gangly, with eyes that glowed faintly in the dark. Margaret noticed subtler things: candle flames wavering without wind, the scent of damp earth inside tightly shut homes, And most disturbingly, the way the fog seemed to linger longer outside certain houses, as if it were watching, waiting. The village of Briarwood had changed, and Margaret feared that something terrible had come with the fog. Determined to uncover the truth, Margaret decided to investigate. She gathered accounts from villagers, compiling a detailed record of the Fig's appearances, and the voices heard. Patterns began to emerge. Certain houses were visited more frequently, and the fog seemed to thicken around places of grief and loss. Mrs. Glover, desperate for answers, approached Margaret, clutching a worn locket. "I know it's not my husband," she whispered, "but it sounds just like him, and it knows things only he would know." Margaret enlisted the help of Tom Jenkins, the blacksmith, who agreed to stay up and watch the fog from his forge. Night after night, he noted how it moved with purpose, almost as if it sought something or someone. Suspicion crept into Briarwood like a disease. Was it the work of something supernatural? Or was there a more human hand involved? Father Ellis, the aging priest, insisted it was the work of restless souls seeking closure, while Old Man Withers, the reclusive trapper, muttered darkly about creatures that lived in the woods, ancient things that could mimic voices. Even Margaret began to suspect certain villagers, like Mr. Caldwell, the undertaker, who seemed far too calm amid the chaos, or the enigmatic widow, Eleanor Blackwood, who never spoke about her husband's disappearance years ago. Then there was young Samuel, who had been acting strangely ever since his sister was lost to the fog. Margaret spoke to the widow Blackwood, who claimed to have seen shapes within the fog, faces that shifted and melted into darkness. "It's not our loved ones," she warned. "It's something else wearing their voices." One evening, Margaret found Mrs. Glover's house ransacked, her belongings scattered, and the front door hanging open. The locket she had shown Margaret was gone. In the distance, the fog curled through the trees, thicker than ever. A new voice called out to Margaret from the mist. This time, it was her mother, gone these many years. Margaret could almost see the silhouette moving behind the fog, a figure that moved just a little too stiffly, a little too wrong. The fog grew bolder, creeping under doors and through cracked windows. Some villagers reported feeling an icy hand brush their skin in the night, while others claimed to hear whispers right next to their ears, even inside their locked homes. Margaret explored every possible theory. Was it a trick of the mind, mass hysteria, or something darker? She even tested the fog by recording the voices she heard, comparing them to old recordings of her brother. The match was uncanny, too perfect. Father Ellis suggested a midnight prayer vigil at the church, hoping to keep the spirits at bay. But the fugue seemed to grow thicker around the chapel. Margaret and Tom Jenkins tried placing salt at the village borders, but it only seemed to slow the mist for a short time. One night, Margaret ventured into the woods, following the whispers, and found strange symbols carved into the trees, their edges glowing faintly under the moonlight. She wondered if the village's dark past held the key key to the mystery. Then, something chilling happened. Little Emma Thompson went missing. Her parents found the front door wide open, footprints leading into the fog, and a single rag doll lying abandoned on the doorstep. Briarwood was no longer just haunted, it was hunted. Margaret organized a search party, but the fog thickened unnaturally, following the searchers whole. Only 2 men returned, their eyes wide with terror, muttering about voices that led them astray. The villagers barricaded themselves in their homes, and Margaret knew she had little time left to solve the mystery before more were lost. Fear gripped Briarwood tighter than ever. Margaret barely slept, her mind racing with theories and fear. More villagers began reporting strange occurrences, children waking up screaming, claiming the fog had whispered their names, and livestock found dead with no visible wounds. As tensions escalated, Margaret took it upon herself to venture into the woods once more. With Tom Jenkins by her side, they followed the glowing symbols deeper, uncovering an old forgotten shrine buried beneath layers of moss and decay. The carvings matched those found on the trees, evidence that the fog's origins were tied to something ancient and unspeakable. The search party that had gone missing returned, but they were different. Their eyes were vacant, their skin cold, and they spoke in unsettling monotones, recounting their time in the fog as a dream they could not wake from. Margaret knew she was running out of time. Margaret pieced together the clues. What if the fog wasn't just a natural phenomenon, but a lingering force tied to the village's past? Legends spoke of a long-forgotten ritual meant to commune with spirits. But what if it had gone terribly wrong? She suspected that the villagers' collective grief and guilt had fed whatever entity lurked within the mist, giving it strength. Desperate, Margaret decided to recreate the ritual, in hopes of either dispelling or controlling the fog. Father Ellis, skeptical but willing, agreed to assist her in preparing the church. Meanwhile, Tom Jenkins set out to gather salt and iron, the old ways of warding off dark spirits. Margaret visited Eleanor Blackwood once more, and this time the widow's lips trembled as she revealed an old journal filled with desperate scrawls about the fog, warnings, incantations, and pleas for forgiveness. "My husband tried to stop it," Eleanor whispered, but it was too late. As the ritual preparations began, Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that someone in the village was hiding something. She scrutinized every action, every hushed conversation. Widow Blackwood seemed more anxious than usual, and Mr. Caldwell's calm demeanor seemed almost too practiced. Then, late one night, Margaret discovered Tom Jenkins missing. His forge was cold, and his tools scattered across the ground. The fog clung to his empty house, and Margaret feared the worst. Meanwhile, the villagers, divided between belief and skepticism, began to turn on one another. Fear and mistrust had eroded their once close-knit community, and Margaret realized that the fog thrived on their discontent. The fog thickened outside the church doors, pressing against the stained glass windows like an impatient predator, and Margaret knew the final confrontation was near. Margaret stood in the empty church, the flickering candlelight barely keeping the darkness at bay. The fog seeped through the cracks in the wooden doors, curling like ghostly fingers. Outside, the villagers huddled in their homes, too afraid to venture out. Tom was still missing, and doubt gnawed at Margaret's resolve. Then the voices began again, soft, pleading, and terribly familiar. Margaret covered her ears, but the whispers slithered through her defenses, calling her name with unnatural sweetness. She dropped to her knees, whispering a desperate prayer. Could she really stop this? Through the stained glass windows, the fog thickened, and Margaret could see shadowy shapes moving within. They pressed against the glass, their faces contorted in anguish and longing. A cold sweat broke across her forehead as she gripped the journal tightly, flipping through its pages with trembling fingers. As the ritual commenced, the fog pulsed angrily outside the church. Margaret sprinkled salt and iron filings in a protective circle, chanting the ancient words from Eleanor Blackwood's journal. The mist recoiled, but then it surged, revealing ghastly figures, distorted and writhing, their faces frozen in expressions of sorrow and rage. One figure stepped forward from the mist, wearing Tom Jenkins' face, his eyes hollow and empty. Margaret's heart shattered, but she held firm, reciting the final incantation with unwavering conviction. The fog creature screeched, its form twisting and unraveling, until the mist began to thin. The ghostly apparitions clawed at the protective barrier, their screams echoing through the church. Margaret's voice wavered, but Father Ellis stepped beside her, chanting with steady determination. The air thickened with an oppressive weight, the fog swirling in violent torrents. Suddenly, the stained glass shattered inward, shards raining down as the fog surged into the sacred space. Margaret fell back, clutching the journal, as the specter of her brother appeared before her, his voice trembling with grief and longing. Margaret's tears fell freely, but she steeled herself. "You are not my brother," she whispered, her voice steady. "You are only a memory, twisted by sorrow." With one final incantation, she hurled a handful of salt into the mist, and the figure dissolved with a haunting wail. The fog retreated, dissipating into the woods as the first light of dawn broke through. The villagers emerged cautiously, their expressions a mixture of relief and grief. Margaret, exhausted but triumphant, held Eleanor Blackwood's journal close to her chest. The village would heal, but the scars left by the fee would remain. Father Ellis placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "You saved us, Margaret," he said quietly. "But some wounds may never fully heal." In the days that followed, the village slowly returned to normal. Children laughed once more, and the market square bustled with life. Yet an unspoken pact bound them all, never to speak of the fee again. Margaret, forever changed, took up the role of guardian, ensuring that the Pumuk never returned. She sealed the old shrine deep within the woods with salt and iron, a silent guardian watching over it. But on certain nights, When the wind whispered through the trees, she could still hear her brother's voice calling her name. And deep in the forest, a faint mist lingered, watching, waiting.